Pinewood Manor stood majestically on the outskirts of a quaint New England town, its grand facade a testament to a bygone era of opulence. Every Christmas, the manor was transformed into a festive spectacle, drawing visitors from miles around to experience its enchanting decorations and warm hospitality. However, beneath the manor's cheerful exterior lay a chilling secret that only surfaced during the silent nights of Christmas. The Thompson family had always cherished their annual Christmas reunion at Pinewood Manor. This year was particularly special as Grandma Eleanor, the matriarch, had passed down the tradition for over 4 decades. The family, comprising siblings Sarah, Michael, Emily, and their spouses and children, arrived on a snowy December evening, their hearts filled with excitement and nostalgia. As they approached the manor, the twinkling lights and the scent of pine welcomed them. The grand entrance was adorned with wreaths, garlands, and an enormous Christmas tree that stood proudly in the foyer. Laughter and the sound of holiday music filled the air, creating an atmosphere of warmth and joy. After dinner, the family gathered in the living room to exchange gifts and share stories. Grandma Eleanor regaled them with tales of Christmases past, her eyes twinkling with memories. As the night grew late, Sarah suggested exploring the manor to discover hidden treasures and forgotten rooms. Intrigued, Michael, Emily, and their children agreed. The family made their way upstairs, where they stumbled upon a door they had never noticed before, a narrow passage leading to the old attic. The door creaked ominously as Sarah pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit space filled with antique furniture, dusty trunks, and cobweb-covered ornaments. As they ventured deeper into the attic, the temperature seemed to drop, and an eerie silence enveloped the room. Emily noticed an old mirror leaning against the far wall, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. She wiped it clean, revealing a beautiful, ornate frame adorned with intricate carvings. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness as the manor's power flickered and went out. The only light came from the flickering flames of the fireplace, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. A sense of unease settled over the family as they heard faint whispers echoing through the attic. Michael, always the skeptic, dismissed it as the wind, but Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The whispers grew louder, forming indistinct words that sent shivers through their bodies. The children clung to their parents, their eyes wide with fear. Out of the corner of her eye, Emily saw a fleeting shadow move across the mirror. She gasped, and the others turned to look, but there was nothing there. The whispers intensified, now clearly chanting, "Leave! Now!" Panic set in as the family attempted to retrace their steps, but the attic seemed to stretch endlessly, the layout changing in impossible ways. Doors led to nowhere, and staircases descended into darkness. The temperature continued to drop, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Suddenly, a spectral figure materialized before them, a woman dressed in Victorian-era attire, her eyes hollow and sorrowful. She reached out a translucent hand, her voice echoing through the room. "You shouldn't be here. This is not a place of joy." Terrified, Sarah mustered the courage to speak. "Who are you? Why are you haunting us?" The apparition's expression softened, and she began to recount her tragic story. Eleanor Pinewood, the original mistress of the manor, had perished in a fire on Christmas Eve over a century ago. The fire had claimed her life and left the manor abandoned for years until it was restored to its former glory. Her spirit remained bound to the manor, unable to find peace, especially during the festive season when memories of her lost family overwhelmed her. She had been the driving force behind the manor's annual Christmas celebrations, hoping that joy would help her heal. Moved by Eleanor's plight, the Thompson family vowed to help. They promised to honor her memory by ensuring that Pinewood Manor remained a place of happiness and togetherness every Christmas. The apparition seemed to accept their promise, her form gradually fading as a warm, comforting light filled the attic. The power returned, and the manor's lights shone brightly once more. The family descended from the attic, their hearts lighter and their bonds strengthened by the night's ordeal. They knew that Pinewood Manor would continue to be a beacon of love and unity, bridging the gap between the living and the departed. Years later, the Thompsons still celebrate Christmas at Pinewood Manor, always remembering the silent night when they encountered Eleanor Pinewood. The manor remains a place where the past and present coexist, a sanctuary where the spirit of Christmas truly lives on. In the heart of Vermont, the small town of Evergreen Hollow was renowned for its picturesque landscapes and tight-knit community. Every Christmas, the town transformed into a winter wonderland, complete with twinkling lights, festive decorations, and the harmonious melodies of carolers filling the crisp night air. However, one particularly cold Christmas Eve would forever change the town's perception of its beloved tradition. Evergreen Hollow had a long-standing tradition of welcoming Christmas with the Midnight Carolers, a group of local residents who dressed in Victorian attire and performed hauntingly beautiful carols at the stroke of midnight. The tradition was said to honor the town's founder, Jonathan Evergreen, who was a passionate musician and had mysteriously disappeared one snowy Christmas Eve a century ago. Residents believed that Jonathan's spirit guided the carolers each year, ensuring that the town remained safe and prosperous. While most embraced the tradition with joy, some whispered about the eerie occurrences that surrounded the Midnight Carolers, especially on the anniversary of Jonathan's disappearance. This Christmas, the Hollow family, Anna, David, and their teenage daughter Lily, moved to Evergreen Hollow seeking a fresh start after the loss of Anna's father. Eager to immerse themselves in the community, they quickly became acquainted with their neighbors and the town's cherished traditions. As Christmas approached, Lily grew particularly fascinated by the Midnight Carolers. She admired their commitment and the enchanting music they produced. However, Anna sensed a lingering unease in the air, especially as the anniversary of Jonathan Evergreen's disappearance neared. On Christmas Eve, the town gathered in the central square, bundled in warm coats and scarves. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. As the clock struck midnight, the Midnight Carolers emerged from the shadows, their Victorian costumes immaculate under the glow of lanterns. Their leader, a tall man named Mr. Hawthorne, began conducting the choir. The carols they sang were both beautiful and haunting, echoing through the silent night. The townsfolk listened in awe, swaying gently to the melodies. Lily watched from the crowd, captivated by the performance. Anna, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. As the final notes of the carol lingered in the air, a sudden gust of wind extinguished the lanterns, plunging the square into darkness. Panic erupted as residents scrambled to find their way. In the chaos, Lily realized that the Midnight Carolers had vanished without a trace. Mr. Hawthorne was nowhere to be seen, and the harmonious melodies had ceased abruptly. Anna grabbed Lily's hand, urging her to stay close. They navigated through the crowd, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The townspeople were whispering frantically about the sudden disappearance of the carolers, with some fearing it was a reenactment of Jonathan Evergreen's fate. Determined to uncover the mystery, Anna and Lily began to investigate. They visited the town library, poring over old records and newspaper clippings about Jonathan Evergreen and the origins of the Midnight Carolers. They discovered that Jonathan had been a gifted composer whose disappearance coincided with the first Midnight Carolers performance. According to local lore, Jonathan had intended to compose a final, perfect carol that would ensure the town's eternal prosperity. However, the night before its completion, he vanished without a trace, leaving his composition unfinished. Some believed that his spirit was bound to the carolers, guiding them each year to perform the incomplete carol in hopes of bringing him back. As Christmas approached once more, Anna and Lily became more involved in the preparations for the Midnight Carolers' performance. They felt an inexplicable connection to the tradition, as if something unseen was guiding their actions. On the following Christmas Eve, the town assembled once again in the central square. The atmosphere was tense, with the memory of the previous year's disappearance still fresh. As midnight approached, Anna noticed a familiar figure among the crowd, Mr. Hawthorne. This time, as the clock struck 12, the Midnight Carolers began their performance. The carols were eerily similar to those from the previous year, but there was an unfinished melody that lingered at the end. Anna realized that this was Jonathan Evergreen's composition, now being completed. As the choir reached the unfinished melody, a cold breeze swept through the square. The lanterns flickered, casting long shadows that danced ominously. Lily felt a chill run down her spine as she watched Mr. Hawthorne approach the center of the square. He began to sing the final note of the composition, his voice resonating with a haunting beauty. As he sang, the air seemed to shimmer, and a spectral figure emerged beside him. It was Jonathan Evergreen himself. The townsfolk gasped in awe and fear as Jonathan's spirit took form. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice echoing through the night. My song is complete, and my soul can finally find peace. With those words, the spectral figure began to fade, dissolving into the night sky. The carolers stopped singing, and the town was enveloped in a serene silence. The lanterns reignited, and the central square was bathed in warm light once more. In the aftermath of the performance, the town of Evergreen Hollow felt a profound sense of closure. The midnight carolers resumed their annual tradition, now with a renewed sense of purpose and gratitude. Anna and Lily became integral members of the choir, ensuring that Jonathan Evergreen's legacy lived on. The Hollow family found solace in the town's embrace, their bond strengthened by the shared experience. Lily often reflected on that magical Christmas night, grateful for the mysteries that had brought her family closer and for the spirit of Evergreen Hollow that had welcomed them with open arms. Years later, the story of the Midnight Carolers and Jonathan Evergreen's final composition became a cherished tale in Evergreen Hollow. Each Christmas Eve, as the carolers sang under the starlit sky, the townsfolk remembered the night when music bridged the gap between the living and the departed, ensuring that the spirit of Christmas remained eternal. Nestled in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, the Mistletoe Inn was a charming bed and breakfast known for its cozy ambiance and festive Christmas decorations. Every winter, families flocked to the inn to celebrate the holiday season, enjoying warm meals, comfortable accommodations, and the enchanting spirit of Christmas. However, beneath its welcoming exterior, the inn held a dark history that resurfaced each Christmas night, bringing with it tales of ghostly apparitions and unexplained phenomena. The Parker family, Tom, Laura, and their two children, Emma and Jack, decided to spend their first Christmas away from the bustle of city life. Seeking tranquility and a break from their hectic schedules, they booked a stay at the Mistletoe Inn, enticed by its picturesque setting and glowing reviews. Excited for a memorable holiday, they arrived on a snowy December afternoon, greeted by the inn's owner, Mrs. Winifred Hartley. Mrs. Hartley was a warm and gracious woman in her late 60s with a penchant for storytelling. She welcomed the Parkers with a hearty handshake and a plate of freshly baked gingerbread cookies. "Welcome to the Mistletoe Inn," she said with a smile. "We have many traditions here, and I hope you'll enjoy your stay." The inn was beautifully decorated, with garlands adorning the staircases, twinkling lights illuminating the hallways, and a grand Christmas tree standing tall in the main lounge. The Parkers settled into their room, which featured a roaring fireplace, comfortable furnishings, and large windows offering stunning views of the snow-covered landscape. That evening, Mrs. Hartley hosted a festive dinner in the dining hall. The family enjoyed a delicious meal of roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and cranberry sauce, followed by dessert and mulled wine. After dinner, Mrs. Hartley gathered the guests around the fireplace to share stories of the inn's history. As the fire crackled, Mrs. Hartley began recounting the story of Eliza Montgomery, the inn's original owner. Eliza was a kind-hearted woman who had built the inn from the ground up in the late 1800s. She was beloved by all who knew her for her generosity and festive spirit. Every Christmas, Eliza hosted grand celebrations, bringing together travelers and locals alike to celebrate the season. However, one Christmas Eve over a century ago, tragedy struck. A fierce storm rolled in, trapping guests inside the inn. Amidst the chaos, Eliza went missing, and despite a frantic search, her body was never found. Some believe that her spirit remained at the inn, ensuring that the Christmas traditions she cherished were upheld each year. During their first night at the inn, the Parkers began to notice subtle, unexplained occurrences. Soft footsteps echoed through the hallways long after they had fallen asleep. Sometimes they heard faint laughter and the distant sound of carols, despite the inn being empty. Emma, an imaginative 8-year-old, was the first to speak up. "Mom, I think someone is playing with my ornaments," she whispered one night, pointing to her decorated Christmas tree. The ornaments had been moved and rearranged overnight, forming intricate patterns that seemed almost intentional. Jack, a curious 10-year-old, insisted he saw a shadowy figure standing by the fireplace, dressed in Victorian attire similar to the illustrations of Eliza Montgomery he had seen in old photographs displayed around the inn. "It was like she was watching us," he said, eyes wide with fear. On Christmas Eve, as the family participated in the inn's traditional festivities, The atmosphere was particularly festive. Mrs. Hartley led everyone in decorating the grand Christmas tree, singing carols, and sharing holiday treats. As midnight approached, she invited the guests to gather in the lounge for a special storytelling session. After the festivities, the Parkers retired to their room, exhausted but happy. Around midnight, Laura was awakened by the sound of soft singing emanating from the hallway. Thinking it was one of the other guests, she got up to investigate. As she stepped into the corridor, the singing ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the hallway, extinguishing the candlelight. In the darkness, Laura felt a presence nearby. A soft whisper filled the air. "Stay. Celebrate ... Before she could react, the lights flickered back on, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. Shaken, Laura returned to her room, where she found Emma and Jack huddled together, eyes wide with fear. "Mom, we saw her," Jack stammered. "She was right by the fireplace." Determined to understand the strange events, Laura approached Mrs. Hartley the next morning. The inn's owner listened attentively before revealing more about Eliza's disappearance. "Some say Eliza never left," she confessed, "that her spirit remains to ensure the inn remains a place of joy and togetherness, just as she always wanted." Intrigued and concerned, Tom decided to delve deeper into the inn's history. He visited the local library, where he discovered old newspaper articles and diaries detailing Eliza's life and the tragic storm that led to her disappearance. According to the accounts, Eliza was preparing for the inn's grandest Christmas celebration when the storm hit, leaving her trapped and unable to escape. Among the diaries, Tom found a reference to an unfinished Christmas song Eliza had been composing, a melody meant to embody the spirit of Christmas and bring happiness to all who heard it. The song was never completed, as Eliza vanished before she could finish her work. Realizing that the unfinished song might hold the key to appeasing Eliza's spirit, Tom shared his findings with Laura and Mrs. Hartley. Together, they decided to complete the song, hoping it would help Eliza find peace and end the hauntings. On Christmas Day, the Parkers and Mrs. Hartley gathered in the lounge to work on completing Eliza's song. They played the old piano that Eliza had used, and Tom, a musician by training, began to piece together the fragmented notes from the diaries. As they worked, the atmosphere grew tense with anticipation. The family could feel Eliza's presence, watching and perhaps guiding them. Finally, after hours of collaboration, the song was complete, a beautiful, uplifting melody that captured the essence of Christmas joy. That evening, the inn hosted a special Christmas concert, inviting all guests to join in singing Eliza's completed song. Mrs. Hartley took the lead, her voice filled with emotion as she began to sing. The Parkers joined in, their voices harmonizing beautifully. As the final notes echoed through the lounge, a warm, radiant light enveloped the room. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Emma and Jack noticed a gentle presence near the fireplace, where the shadowy figure of Eliza had once stood. This time, however, Eliza's spirit appeared serene, a soft smile gracing her translucent features. "Thank you," her voice whispered, more audible and comforting than before. "Now I can rest." With that, Eliza's apparition faded into the light, leaving behind a sense of peace and fulfillment. The haunting had ended, and the Mistletoe Inn was free from its restless spirit. The following morning, the Parkers awoke to a bright, sunlit Christmas morning. The inn felt transformed, no longer overshadowed by fear, but filled with a renewed sense of warmth and joy. Guests exchanged smiles and shared stories of the miraculous concert the night before. Mrs. Hartley expressed her gratitude to the Parkers for their dedication in completing Eliza's song. "You have not only helped Eliza find peace, but have also restored the true spirit of Christmas to the Mistletoe Inn," she said warmly. The Parker family spent the rest of their stay enjoying the inn's hospitality, participating in joyful activities, and forging lasting memories. As they prepared to leave, Emma hugged Mrs. Hartley tightly. "Thank you for helping Eliza," she said softly. Mrs. Hartley smiled. "Christmas is a time for love, forgiveness, and new beginnings. I'm glad you could be a part of it." Years later, the story of the ghost of the Mistletoe Inn became a cherished legend in the Appalachian region. The inn continued to welcome guests from near and far, each visiting to experience its unique charm and the heartfelt Christmas traditions that had been preserved through the Parkers' efforts. Eliza Montgomery's spirit remained at peace, her legacy living on in the joyous celebrations and the harmonious melodies that filled the inn each holiday season. The Mistletoe Inn stood as a testament to the enduring power of love, community, and the true spirit of Christmas. Deep in the heart of the Rocky Mountains lies the secluded village of Silver Pine, a place where winter blankets the landscape in pristine snow each Christmas season. The village is renowned for its charming traditions, including the annual Christmas Eve sleigh ride through the enchanted forest. However, beneath the idyllic facade of Silver Pine lies a forgotten tale of tragedy and restless spirits that resurfaces every Christmas night, entwining with the village's beloved traditions. The Whitaker family, James, Rebecca, and their teenage son, Ethan, decided to spend their first Christmas in Silver Pine, seeking solace and a fresh start after the recent loss of James's brother, who had tragically disappeared during a Christmas sleigh ride years ago. Intrigued by the village's reputation for serene beauty and festive celebrations, they arrived on a snowy December afternoon, greeted warmly by the villagers. As they settled into their cozy cabin adorned with twinkling lights and festive decorations, James couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. The village, though picturesque, seemed to hold secrets that the family was yet to uncover. On their first evening, the Whitakers attended the village's Christmas Eve celebration in the town square. The event was a vibrant display of holiday cheer, featuring a grand Christmas tree, live music, and the much-anticipated sleigh ride through the enchanted forest. As they mingled with the villagers, an elderly woman named Margaret approached them. With a gentle smile and a twinkle in her eye, she shared the village's most cherished legend. Every Christmas Eve, the spirits of those who lost their lives in the forest join us for the sleigh ride. It's a way to honor their memories and keep their spirits alive. James listened intently, his thoughts drifting to his brother's disappearance. Rebecca, sensing his unease, squeezed his hand reassuringly. Ethan, ever curious, asked, "Has anyone ever seen the spirits?" Margaret's expression grew somber. "Some say they appear as shadows in the trees or hear the distant jingling of sleigh bells. Others claim to see the ghostly figure of a young man searching for his lost sleigh." Determined to embrace the village's traditions, the Whitakers decided to join the sleigh ride the following evening. They met with Mr. Thompson, the village's experienced sleigh driver, who assured them of a safe and memorable journey. As night fell, the village square transformed into a magical winter wonderland. The air was filled with the scent of pine and mulled wine, and the sound of carols echoed through the crisp night. The Whitakers, along with other families, gathered around the decorated sleighs, their hearts filled with anticipation. James couldn't shake the feeling that his brother's spirit was watching over him, guiding him to uncover the truth behind his disappearance. Under a canopy of shimmering stars, the sleighs began their journey into the enchanted forest. The path was illuminated by lanterns, casting a warm glow on the snow-covered trees. The villagers sang carols, their voices blending harmoniously with the night sounds. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere grew quieter, the sounds of the village fading into the distance. Ethan, seated beside him, whispered, "This place is beautiful, but it feels a bit eerie." James nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of his brother. Rebecca comforted him, sensing his unease. Suddenly, a chilling wind swept through the trees, and the sleighs came to an abrupt halt. Mr. Thompson's voice trembled as he announced, "Stay calm, everyone. We'll be here for a moment." In the stillness of the night, a faint jingling of sleigh bells echoed through the forest. The Whitakers looked around, their hearts pounding. Out of the darkness, a spectral figure emerged, a man in Victorian-era attire, standing beside a dilapidated sleigh. James's breath caught in his throat. The apparition bore a striking resemblance to his late brother Thomas, down to the same unruly hair and earnest eyes. "Thomas?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The ghostly figure raised a hand, pointing towards the deeper parts of the forest. "Find the forgotten sleigh." It spoke, the words carried by a haunting echo. "Only then can peace be restored." Mr. Thompson, sensing the gravity of the situation, decided to disembark the sleighs and assist the Whitakers in locating the forgotten sleigh. Armed with lanterns, they ventured into the dense forest, guided by the apparition's direction. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they navigated through the thick trees. The air grew colder, and an oppressive silence enveloped them. Ethan clung to his parents, his youthful bravery wavering in the face of the unknown. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon an old clearing. In the center stood a forgotten sleigh, covered in snow and ivy, its once vibrant red paint now faded and chipped. Nearby lay scattered remnants of old harnesses and tattered blankets. James approached the sleigh cautiously, memories of his brother flooding his mind. He reached out, touching the cold metal. "Thomas, is this your sleigh?" As James touched the sleigh, the forest seemed to come alive with memories. Visions of that fateful Christmas Eve played out before them. Thomas leading the sleigh through the same enchanted forest, laughter echoing, and the joyous spirit of the season. But the joyous scene quickly turned to chaos as a sudden blizzard descended upon them. The sleigh was lost in the raging storm, and Thomas was never seen again. The memory faded, leaving only the sorrow and unresolved grief that had bound his spirit to Silverpine. Rebecca placed a comforting hand on James's shoulder. "Maybe we can help him find peace." Determined to honor Thomas's memory, the Whitakers and Mr. Thompson decided to reassemble the forgotten sleigh. Using the remnants they found, they worked together to restore it, hoping to guide Thomas's spirit towards rest. Ethan, inspired by the unfolding events, took the lead in gathering materials, his youthful enthusiasm rekindling the warmth that the family had been missing. Rebecca and James coordinated their efforts, their bond strengthening through the shared mission. As dawn approached, the sleigh began to take shape once more, its presence in the clearing symbolizing hope and closure. With the sleigh restored, Mr. Thompson suggested one final ride to honor Thomas and complete the circle of tradition. The Whitakers agreed, feeling a sense of purpose that had eluded them since their arrival. Under the first light of Christmas morning, the group prepared the sleigh for the journey. As they set off, the forest seemed less ominous, the air filled with a sense of anticipation and reverence. As they rode through the familiar path, the atmosphere shifted. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by the gentle sounds of nature awakening. The sight of the sun reflecting off the snow created a breathtaking panorama. Suddenly, the spectral figure of Thomas appeared once more, standing beside the sleigh. This time, his expression was peaceful, a soft smile gracing his features. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. "I can finally rest." With those words, the apparition began to fade, blending seamlessly with the morning light. The sleigh continued its journey, the Whitakers feeling a profound sense of fulfillment and peace. Back in Silverpine, the Whitakers were greeted with warm smiles and heartfelt congratulations from the villagers. The successful completion of the forgotten sleigh had not only brought closure to James, but had also strengthened the community's bond. James felt a weight lift off his shoulders, knowing that his brother's spirit had found peace. Rebecca and Ethan, too, felt a renewed sense of hope and belonging in their new home. The Whitakers embraced the rest of their stay in Silverpine, participating in the village's joyful celebrations and creating new traditions of their own. The enchanted forest, once a place of fear and mystery, now symbolized resilience and the enduring power of family and community. Years later, the story of the Whitaker family's Christmas in Silverpine became a cherished part of the village's lore. The forgotten sleigh was restored to its place of honor in the town square, serving as a reminder of the importance of remembering the past while embracing the future. Silverpine continued to welcome visitors each winter, its traditions enriched by the Whitakers' tale of love, loss, and the unbreakable bonds that transcend even death. The village stood as a beacon of hope, where the true spirit of Christmas lived on in every heart and every snowflake that fell from the sky. The snow was falling heavily that Christmas Eve, blanketing the small town in a cold, eerie silence. The streets were deserted, as families stayed indoors, basking in the warmth of their fireplaces and the festive glow of Christmas lights. But for Claire, it was just another lonely evening. She had recently moved to the outskirts of town after her divorce, seeking solace in the quiet of the countryside. Her new home was a small, rustic cabin nestled at the edge of a dense forest. It was charming in daylight, but took on a haunting air when night fell. That night, the darkness outside seemed impenetrable, the only light coming from the flickering Christmas tree in her living room. Claire sat on her couch, sipping hot cocoa. the crackling fire the only sound breaking the stillness. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. She sighed, missing the company of her family. Her ex-husband had taken the kids this year, leaving her to spend Christmas alone for the first time in years. As she stared into the fire, lost in thought, a sudden, loud knock at the door made her jump. The sound echoed through the cabin, shattering the tranquil silence. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could possibly be out in this weather, at this hour? Slowly, Claire got up, her bare feet hesitant against the cold wooden floor. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. At first, she saw nothing but swirling snow. Then a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, his face partially obscured by a hood. He stood perfectly still, staring at the door. "Who's there?" Claire called out, her voice trembling slightly. The man didn't answer. Instead, he knocked again, this time more insistently. Claire hesitated. Every instinct told her not to open the door. She glanced at her phone on the table, debating whether to call the police. But what would she say? A stranger knocking on her door wasn't exactly a crime. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to sound braver than she felt. "I'm lost," the man finally replied, his voice muffled by the door. "My car broke down. Can I come in and use your phone?" Claire's heart raced. She didn't like the idea of letting a stranger in, especially not on a night like this. But what if he was genuinely in trouble? The storm was brutal, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. "I'll call someone for you," she said, her voice firm. "Just wait there." She turned to grab her phone, but when she looked back through the peephole, the man was gone. The porch was empty, the snow undisturbed. A chill ran down her spine. Suddenly, a loud thud came from the back of the cabin. Claire spun around, her breath catching in her throat. It sounded like something, or someone, was trying to get in through the back door. She grabbed a fireplace poker and crept toward the kitchen, her hands trembling. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The thudding stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear any sound over the howling wind. Then, the knocking returned, this time on the front door. Claire's blood ran cold. She tiptoed back to the living room, clutching the poker like a lifeline. Peering through the peephole again, she saw the man standing there, his hood still obscuring his face. But something was different now. His posture was wrong, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. "I just need to come in for a minute," he said, his voice eerily calm. "It's freezing out here." Claire's instincts screamed at her to keep the door locked. She backed away slowly, her mind racing. She needed to call the police, but her phone was in the living room, and she couldn't risk turning her back on the door. The knocking grew louder, more aggressive. Then, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire's grip on the poker tightened as she crept toward the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of where the man had gone. As she peered through the curtain, her heart nearly stopped. The man was standing just outside the window, his face pressed against the glass. His hood had fallen back, revealing hollow eyes and a twisted grin that didn't seem human. Claire stumbled backward, a scream catching in her throat. The lights flickered, and then the cabin was plunged into darkness. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the snow outside. Claire's breathing was ragged as she fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. 911. "What's your emergency?" the operator answered. "There's someone outside my house," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "He's trying to get in. Stay on the line," the operator instructed. "Officers are on their way." But before Claire could respond, the line went dead. She stared at her phone in disbelief, the screen now showing no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell tower. A sudden crash came from the back of the house. Claire spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. She could hear heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the kitchen. Whoever, or whatever it was, they were inside now. Claire backed into a corner, clutching the poker like a weapon. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down her spine. She held her breath, praying the intruder wouldn't find her. The figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint glow of the snow outside. It was the man, but something about him was grotesquely wrong. His limbs were too long, his movements jerky and unnatural. He tilted his head as if studying her, and then let out a guttural laugh that echoed through the cabin. Claire screamed, swinging the poker with all her strength. The man, or creature, dodged it easily, his grin widening. She stumbled toward the door, desperation fueling her movements. She managed to fling it open and ran out into the storm, the icy wind cutting through her like a knife. She didn't stop running until she reached the main road, her bare feet numb from the snow. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and she waved frantically, collapsing in relief as the car pulled over. The driver, an older man, helped her into the vehicle, his expression one of concern. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked. "There's someone in my house," Claire gasped. "Please call the police." The man nodded, pulling out his phone. But when Claire turned to look back at her cabin, her blood ran cold. The windows were dark, the door shut tight. There was no sign of the man, or the creature. When the police arrived, they found no evidence of a break-in, no footprints in the snow, no signs of forced entry. It was as if nothing had happened. But Claire knew what she had seen, and she knew she could never spend another Christmas Eve alone in that cabin again. The snow fell softly outside, blanketing the quiet suburban street in a serene stillness. Inside the Parker home, the warmth of the fireplace cast a cozy glow, and the Christmas tree stood tall, adorned with twinkling lights and ornaments collected over decades. For Anna Parker, this Christmas Eve was bittersweet. It was the first holiday she and her 9-year-old daughter Lily would spend without her husband James, who had passed away unexpectedly the previous spring. To make the evening special for Lily, Anna went all out. Cookies baking in the oven, Christmas music softly playing, and the twinkling tree creating a magical ambiance. Yet, beneath the festive cheer, an uneasy stillness lingered in the air, as if the house itself mourned the absence of James. "Mommy, can we put this one on the tree?" Lily asked, holding up a small, ornate box she had found in a dusty corner of the attic. Anna's brow furrowed. "What's that, sweetie?" she asked, kneeling down. Lily opened the box to reveal a delicate, antique Christmas ornament. It was a hand-painted glass bauble, depicting a snowy village under a deep blue sky. It was beautiful, but Anna didn't recognize it. "That's strange," Anna murmured. "I don't remember seeing this before." "Can we hang it?" Lily asked, her wide eyes filled with excitement. Anna hesitated, a chill creeping down her spine as she examined the ornament. The craftsmanship was exquisite, but something about it felt off. She couldn't explain it. Shaking off the feeling, she smiled at Lily. "Of course. Let's put it in a special spot." Lily carefully hung the ornament on a low branch of the tree, admiring how it caught the light. "It's perfect," she exclaimed. As the evening wore on, Anna tried to enjoy their Christmas Eve traditions, but she couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was wrong. She found herself glancing at the ornament repeatedly, its intricate details seeming to shift slightly each time she looked at it. The snowy village almost seemed alive, as if tiny figures moved within its painted surface. By the time Lily went to bed, Anna was on edge. The house felt colder than usual, despite the roaring fire. She decided to call it a night, turning off the lights and heading upstairs to her bedroom. Anna was jolted awake sometime after midnight by a faint sound, soft, rhythmic tapping. She sat up, her heart pounding in the darkness. The noise was coming from downstairs near the living room. "Lily!" she called out, but there was no response. Grabbing her phone for light, Anna crept down the stairs. The tapping grew louder with each step. It was coming from the Christmas tree. She froze when she saw the ornament, its once idyllic village now shrouded in an eerie, swirling fog. Tiny, shadowy figures moved frantically within the painted scene, as though they were trying to escape. The tapping stopped abruptly. Anna stared at the ornament, her breath catching in her throat. Was she losing her mind? She reached out to touch it, but before her fingers could make contact, the lights on the tree flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. A cold draft swept through the house, carrying with it a faint whisper. Anna turned sharply, her phone casting a weak beam of light across the room. The whisper grew louder, a chorus of overlapping voices, too faint to understand, but unmistakably desperate. "Lily!" Anna shouted, her voice breaking. She raced upstairs to her daughter's room, only to find the bed empty. The window was wide open, snow drifting onto the floor. Panic surged through her as she leaned out the window, calling for her daughter into the snowy night. "Mommy?" Lily's voice came from behind her. Anna whirled around to see Lily standing in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Anna asked, pulling her into a tight hug. "There's someone in the house," Lily whispered. Anna's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Where did you see them?" "In the living room," Lily said. "They were by the tree. I thought it was Daddy at first, but—" Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in Anna's shoulder. Anna's heart raced as she grabbed a heavy flashlight from the nightstand. "Stay close to me," she told Lily. Together they crept back downstairs. The living room was empty, but the air was thick with an oppressive, icy stillness. The ornament now glowed faintly, its foggy interior illuminated by a dim, unnatural light. Anna's grip tightened on the flashlight as the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Get out of my house!" Anna shouted, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The tree began to shake violently, ornaments crashing to the floor. The antique bauble remained untouched, its glow intensifying. Anna shielded Lily as the growl grew louder, reverberating through the room. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the chaos stopped. The room was silent. The ornament lay on the floor, its once beautiful surface now cracked and blackened. Anna picked it up gingerly, feeling a strange warmth emanating from it. Inside, the painted village was gone, replaced by swirling darkness. "We have to get rid of it," Anna said, her voice firm. She grabbed a metal box from the kitchen and placed the ornament inside, sealing it tightly. She and Lily braved the snowstorm, driving to the edge of the nearby woods. There, Anna dug a hole in the frozen ground and buried the box deep beneath the snow. As they drove back home, the weight on Anna's chest began to lift. The house felt warmer, safer, when they returned. She tucked Lily back into bed, whispering reassurances as she kissed her forehead. But as Anna lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't entirely alone. The whispers were gone, but the memory of that growl lingered. Sleep came fitfully, and when morning arrived, Anna was relieved to see the sun shining brightly over the snow-covered landscape. Downstairs, the Christmas tree stood bare, its decorations scattered on the floor. Anna cleaned up, determined to make the day as normal as possible for Lily. They opened presents, played in the snow, and spent the day trying to forget the horrors of the night before. But as Anna carried the last of the wrapping paper to the trash bin outside, she froze. Sitting on the porch railing, gleaming in the winter sunlight, was the ornament. Its surface was pristine, the snowy village inside restored to its former beauty. Anna's breath caught in her throat as the faintest whisper reached her ears. "Merry Christmas, Anna." It was a crisp Christmas Eve night in the small town of Maple Ridge. Snow blanketed the streets, muffling the sounds of the world. Twinkling lights adorned every house, casting a festive glow against the frost-covered windows. For Sarah Mitchell, the holiday spirit was muted this year. She had recently moved into her late grandmother's old home after inheriting it, and the place, though quaint, always felt unnervingly quiet. Sarah was alone, sipping a glass of wine by the fireplace, her favorite Christmas movie playing in the background. The house was tucked away at the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods that seemed darker than usual under the cloud-covered moon. She had tried to decorate the home with a tree, garlands, and candles, but the solitude of her first Christmas without family weighed heavily. Just as Sarah started to feel the warmth of the fire seep into her bones, a faint tapping broke the silence. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, and coming from the window beside the front door. Tap, tap, tap. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't the gentle knock of a neighbor or carolers. Those were cheerful and polite. This tapping was sinister, almost taunting. She stood up, her glass trembling slightly in her hand. She approached the window cautiously, her breath fogging up the glass as she peered out into the dark. The porch light barely illuminated the area, but she could make out footprints in the snow leading up to her door. Large, heavy prints that didn't belong to her. There was no one outside. Sarah's rational mind kicked in. Maybe it was kids playing a prank or a delivery driver dropping off a package. She tried to brush it off and returned to the couch, turning up the volume on the TV to drown out her nerves. But then came the knock. Bang, bang, bang. It was louder, more insistent this time. Sarah's stomach knotted as she stood up again, her movements slower now. She grabbed her phone from the coffee table, unlocking it with shaky fingers. She debated calling the police, but what would she say? Someone knocked on her door? Hello? She called out, her voice steady but uneasy. No answer. Sarah's grip on her phone tightened as she approached the door. She peered through the peephole and saw nothing, just the empty porch and swirling snow. Her breathing was shallow as she double-checked the locks, ensuring the deadbolt was secure. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. Sarah stepped away from the door, every creak of the old wooden floorboards echoing in her ears. She glanced at the windows, their frosty panes now feeling like fragile barriers between her and whoever, or whatever, was outside. Suddenly the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the fireplace. Sarah gasped, her hands fumbling for the flashlight app on her phone. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the windows as if nature itself had joined forces with the night's menace. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A text message. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "Why don't you let me in, Sarah?" Her blood ran cold. She dropped the phone, its light casting eerie shadows on the walls as it hit the floor. Someone knew her name. "Who's there?" she shouted, panic creeping into her voice. No response. She picked up the phone and dialed 911, her fingers trembling so much she almost dropped it again. The operator's calm voice came through, asking for her emergency. "There's someone outside my house," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "They're knocking, and they just texted me. They know my name." "Stay calm, ma'am. Officers are on their way. Stay on the line with me." Sarah nodded, even though the operator couldn't see her. She crept toward the kitchen, searching for something, anything she could use to defend herself. Her hand landed on a heavy cast-iron skillet. It wasn't much, but it was something. The knocking resumed, this time from the back door. It was louder, more violent, as if someone was trying to break it down. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she backed into the living room, clutching the skillet. Then she heard it, the sound of boots crunching on snow. She turned toward the window and screamed. A figure stood just outside, their face obscured by the shadows of a hood. They didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, staring into the house. "Officers are almost there, ma'am," the operator said, her voice distant against the roaring fear in Sarah's ears. The figure finally moved, but not away from the house. They pressed their hand against the glass, leaving a foggy imprint. Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She ran to the front door, unlocked it, and bolted outside into the freezing night. The cold air hit her like a wall, but she didn't stop running. Her bare feet sank into the snow as she sprinted toward her car. She fumbled with her keys, her breath coming in frantic gasps. As she unlocked the car and slid inside, she locked the doors and started the engine. Looking back at the house, she saw the figure standing on the porch, illuminated by her car's headlights. They turned their heads slowly toward her, as if to acknowledge her escape. Then, with deliberate slowness, they raised a gloved hand and waved. Sarah's heart threatened to burst as she sped down the road. She didn't stop until she saw the flashing lights of a police cruiser. She pulled over, jumping out of the car to meet the officers. "They're at my house," she yelled. "Please, you have to hurry." The officers didn't waste a second. They sped toward her home while Sarah followed behind, her stomach churning with dread. When they arrived, the house was empty. The snow on the porch was undisturbed, as if no one had ever been there. The back door was locked, the windows intact. There were no footprints in the snow. Sarah tried to explain what had happened, but the officers exchanged doubtful looks. They assured her they would patrol the area and left her alone once more. She sat in her car, staring at the dark house. Her phone buzzed again. A new text. "See you next Christmas, Sarah." She screamed and threw the phone onto the passenger seat. She knew she couldn't go back inside. The house wasn't just quiet now. It felt alive, watching her, waiting for her to return. She started the car and drove, determined to spend Christmas Eve anywhere but there. As the snow fell heavier, her headlights barely piercing the darkness, Sarah's mind raced. Who was the stalker? Why had they chosen her? And more terrifyingly, how did they know her name? She never found the answers, but one thing was certain. She would never spend another Christmas Eve alone in that house again. The Brooks family was well known in the small town of Cedar Hollow for their elaborate Christmas displays. Each year, their home turned into a winter wonderland with thousands of twinkling lights, a life-sized Santa sleigh on the lawn, and a perfectly decorated tree glowing through the front window. This year was no different, except for the unease that seemed to linger in the air. It was Christmas Eve, and as the snow gently fell, neighbors gathered to admire the Brooks' dazzling lights and wish each other a happy holiday. The laughter of children echoed in the cold night, but something about the Brooks house seemed off. The lights were as bright as ever, the decorations immaculate, but no one had seen the family all day. "They're probably just busy getting ready for Christmas," one neighbor suggested, but another shook their head. The Brooks are always outside, handing out cocoa and chatting with everyone on Christmas Eve. It's not like them to stay inside. By midnight, the street was quiet again. Most families had gone to bed, excited for the morning to come. But across the street, Mrs. Peterson couldn't sleep. Something about the Brooks house gnawed at her. The lights were still on, the Christmas music playing faintly through the night, but there wasn't a single sign of life inside. Finally, her curiosity got the better of her. She bundled up in her coat and boots and stepped into the snow. As she approached the Brooks house, the music grew louder. She knocked softly on the door, but there was no answer. She tried again, this time harder, her knocks echoing into the silent night. "Mr. Brooks? Mrs. Brooks?" she called, her voice shaky. When no one responded, she tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The warmth of the house wrapped around her, and the smell of pine and cinnamon lingered in the air. The Christmas tree sparkled in the corner, and stockings hung neatly over the fireplace. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. "Hello?" she called again, her voice trembling. Her eyes scanned the living room. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture or missing decorations. It looked as though the family had simply vanished in the middle of their holiday preparations. The unease in her chest deepened as she noticed something strange. 4 steaming mugs of cocoa sat on the coffee table, untouched. Her heart raced as she moved further into the house. The kitchen was spotless, the table set for Christmas breakfast. A small pile of wrapped presents sat on the counter, each labeled with a family member's name. The unease gave way to fear as Mrs. Peterson noticed something else. There were no coats hanging by the door, no boots on the mat. It was as if the Brooks had walked out into the freezing snow without any protection. Suddenly, she heard a faint noise upstairs. It was rhythmic, almost like whispering. Her body froze, every instinct screaming for her to leave. But her legs moved forward as though compelled by an unseen force. She climbed the staircase slowly, her footsteps barely making a sound against the carpeted steps. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't English. No, it wasn't a language she recognized at all. It sounded guttural and ancient, like the words of something inhuman. She stopped in front of the master bedroom, the source of the sound. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorknob, but before she could touch it, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. Gathering her courage, she pushed the door open. The room was empty, the bed neatly made. The only sign of life was a small, wrapped gift sitting on the nightstand. Mrs. Peterson's hands trembled as she picked it up. The tag read, "To the Brooks family, forever together." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She dropped the box and backed out of the room, her breath coming in panicked gasps. As she turned to leave, she heard a faint laugh behind her. A child's laugh. She spun around, her eyes darting around the empty hallway. That was enough. She bolted down the stairs, her heart pounding as she ran for the door. But as she reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was locked, the deadbolt turning before her eyes. "Let me out!" she screamed, banging on the door. But no one heard her cries. The lights in the house began to flicker, the Christmas trees glow casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. A sudden gust of icy wind blew through the house, extinguishing the lights and plunging the room into darkness. Mrs. Peterson turned, her eyes adjusting to the faint glow of the snow outside. Standing by the tree were 4 shadowy figures, 2 adults and 2 children. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes hollow. The tallest figure stepped forward, extending a hand toward her. "Stay," it whispered, its voice hollow and echoing. "Join us." Mrs. Peterson screamed, stumbling backward. The shadows closed in, their icy presence suffocating. She collapsed onto the floor, her vision blurring as the whispering voices filled her ears, wrapping around her like a cold, suffocating blanket. The next morning, Cedar Hollow woke to a pristine Christmas day. The snow sparkled under the sunlight, and the neighborhood was alive with the sounds of children laughing and families celebrating. But the Brooks house was eerily quiet. Mrs. Peterson's son, concerned that she hadn't answered his calls, walked over to check on her. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Just like the Brooks, Mrs. Peterson had vanished without a trace. Inside, the house looked as though nothing had happened. The tree was still lit, the stockings still hung, and the steaming mugs of cocoa on the coffee table were now joined by a 5th. And on the nightstand in the master bedroom sat the small, wrapped gift, its tag rewritten, "To the Petersons, forever together." It was a Christmas Eve like no other. Snow blanketed the town of hollow pines, muffling every sound, leaving only the faint rustle of the icy wind. I was spending the night alone in my parents' old house. They had retired to Florida earlier that year, leaving me to look after the property during the holidays. The house was large and drafty, and though decorated with twinkling lights and garlands, it always felt eerily quiet when no one else was around. I was sitting by the fireplace in the living room, sipping hot chocolate and scrolling through my phone. The Christmas tree sparkled brightly in the corner, its reflection shimmering in the large bay window across the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, creating a scene so still it felt frozen in time. It was almost midnight when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow had moved across the window, quick and fleeting. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, staring at the glass. Nothing. Just the snow drifting lazily under the glow of the streetlight. I shook my head, blaming my overactive imagination. Spending Christmas Eve alone had made me jumpy. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept into my chest. I pulled the curtains closed, trying to block out the unsettling thoughts, and turned up the volume on the TV. But then it happened again. This time, I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps crunching in the snow outside. My body stiffened, and I strained to listen, the sound of my heartbeat almost drowning everything out. Someone was out there. Grabbing my phone, I moved cautiously toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The yard was empty, the snow undisturbed. The streetlight cast long shadows from the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. Maybe it's just a stray animal, I whispered to myself, trying to calm the growing panic. As I let the curtain fall back into place, the motion-activated porch light flickered on. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the light's reach. It was a tall, dark figure, its outline barely visible against the snowy backdrop. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. My stomach twisted into knots. I fumbled with my phone, dialing 911, but my fingers were trembling so much that I almost dropped it. 911, what's your emergency? The operator answered. There's someone outside my house, I whispered, my voice shaking. They're just standing there watching me. Are all your doors and windows locked? The operator asked calmly. Yes, I replied, glancing nervously at the back door. Please send someone quickly. Stay on the line with me. Officers are on their way. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. My eyes stayed glued to the window, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. I let out a shaky breath, but the relief was short-lived. A loud thud came from the back of the house. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I moved toward the kitchen, the floor creaking beneath my feet. The thud came again, louder this time, like something or someone was pounding on the back door. I stopped in my tracks, my hand gripping the phone like a lifeline. "They're at the back door now," I whispered into the receiver. "Stay where you are," the operator instructed. "Help is almost there." The pounding stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. I held my breath, listening for any sound. Then I heard it. A faint scratching, like fingernails against glass. The porch light flickered and went out, plunging the yard into darkness. The only light now came from the faint glow of the Christmas tree in the living room. My mind raced as I backed away, keeping my eyes on the kitchen window. Suddenly a voice came from outside, low and distorted. "Let me in." I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would burst. The voice was inhuman, hollow and echoing, as if it didn't belong to this world. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. There was no reply, just a low, guttural laugh that sent chills down my spine. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as though it was trying to claw its way inside. I ran to the living room, grabbing the fireplace poker for protection. The sound stopped. For a moment, the house was silent again, and I dared to hope that whoever, or whatever it was, had gone. But then, I saw it. A face pressed against the bay window, pale and twisted, its eyes black and soulless. It grinned at me, its teeth sharp and glistening. I screamed, stumbling backward. The face disappeared, but the pounding on the front door began, shaking the entire house. The tree's ornaments rattled and the lights flickered wildly. "Help is outside," the operator said suddenly. "Officers are there." I bolted to the window, my breath fogging up the glass as I peered outside. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance. Relief washed over me as I saw two officers step out of their cruiser, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But my relief was short-lived. As the officers approached the house, the shadow reappeared, this time behind them. It moved unnaturally fast, its long limbs bending at impossible angles. I banged on the window trying to warn them, but it was too late. The shadow enveloped the officers, their screams piercing the night. I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me. The house fell silent once more, the flashing lights of the cruiser the only sign that anyone had ever been there. I stayed huddled in the corner until morning, too afraid to move. When the sun finally rose, I ventured outside. The cruiser was gone. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign that the officers, or the shadow, had ever been there. But as I looked back at the house, my blood turned to ice. Written in frost on the bay window were the words, "Next Christmas." It all started when I decided to visit the old Willow Creek Christmas tree farm. It was a family tradition, passed down from my grandparents, to pick out the perfect tree to light up our home. This year, however, I was alone. My parents had moved to Florida, and my younger sister, Emily, had taken a job overseas. It felt strange to uphold the tradition by myself, but I figured it would help bring some holiday cheer to my otherwise lonely apartment. The farm wasn't the same as I remembered. The once bustling entrance was eerily silent, save for the creak of the rusted sign swinging in the cold December wind. A thin layer of snow blanketed the ground, but it wasn't pristine. It was marred by what looked like dark stains, patches of crimson melting into the white. I shook off the chill creeping up my spine, telling myself it was probably spilled paint or something equally harmless. The owner, a wiry old man with deep-set eyes and a voice like gravel, greeted me near the barn. His name tag read Earl, though his grim expression didn't match the festive jingles blaring faintly from a tinny speaker nearby. "Here for a tree?" he asked, his gaze lingering on me a little too long. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yep, just keeping up with tradition." Earl's eyes narrowed. "Stick to the trees in the front rows," he said, gesturing toward the well-lit area near the barn. "Don't go wandering too far." I gave him a polite nod, though his warning set my nerves on edge. The way he said it wasn't casual. It was a command, almost desperate. But I wasn't about to let some weird old man ruin my evening. Rows of evergreens stretched out before me, their needles glistening under the faint glow of string lights. The air smelled of sap and earth, a comforting aroma that brought back childhood memories of warm cocoa and Christmas morning excitement. Most of the trees were beautiful, symmetrical, and lush, but none of them felt right. I wandered further down the rows, past the cheerful lights, and into the darker part of the farm. Earl's warning echoed in my mind, but I brushed it off. After all, what harm could there be in exploring a little? The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The music from the barn faded, and even the wind seemed to hush. That's when I saw it. A tall, perfectly shaped tree standing apart from the others. Its branches were dense and dark green, almost black in the dim light. It seemed to call to me, as though it had been waiting for someone to notice it. Without thinking, I touched the bark, running my fingers along its rough surface. That's when I noticed something strange. My hand came away sticky with a dark red substance. Sap, I thought. It had to be sap. But as I wiped it on my jeans, the texture felt wrong. Thicker, warmer. My pulse quickened as I glanced at my hand under the faint light of my phone. It wasn't sap. It was blood. A sharp crack broke the silence, like a branch snapping under heavy weight. I whipped around, shining my phone's flashlight into the rows of trees behind me. Shadows shifted, but there was no one there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The only response was the soft rustling of branches, though there was no wind. I turned back to the tree, debating whether to head back to the barn. But something about it wouldn't let me leave. It felt alive, almost sentient, as though it were waiting for me to make a decision. I pulled out the small handsaw Earl had given me and began cutting. The blade moved slower than it should have, as if the wood were resisting. The smell of iron filled the air, sharp and nauseating, and I could swear the tree groaned with every push of the saw. Sweat dripped down my face despite the freezing temperature, and by the time I cut through the trunk, I was trembling. As the tree tipped over, a low, guttural moan echoed through the grove. I froze, gripping the saw tightly, my breath visible in frantic puffs. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I dragged the tree back to my car, each step feeling heavier than the last. The blood, or whatever it was, had dried on my hands, leaving behind a dark, crusty residue. Earl was nowhere to be seen when I passed the barn, and the farm felt utterly abandoned. The drive home was uneventful, but the tree seemed to dominate the rearview mirror, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the back seat. When I finally got it inside my apartment, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as though I had escaped something terrible. But that relief didn't last. I decorated the tree with the usual ornaments, glass baubles, twinkling lights, and a star for the top. For a moment it looked perfect, and I allowed myself to relax. But as night fell, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered, though there was no issue with the electricity. The air grew cold, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones. And then there was the smell, that sharp, metallic scent of blood, growing stronger by the minute. I tried to ignore it, curling up on the couch with a blanket and a movie. But halfway through I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the direction of the tree. My heart thudded as I turned to look. The ornaments were swinging gently, as though something had brushed against them. Probably just settling, I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. Then came the whisper. It was so soft I almost missed it, but it was there. A low, rasping voice that seemed to emanate from the tree itself. "Why did you take me?" I bolted upright, my chest tightening with fear. Grabbing my phone, I shone its light on the tree. The ornaments reflected the glow, but something else caught my eye. Dark streaks were oozing from the trunk, pooling onto the floor. Blood. It wasn't just sap, it was real, thick and glistening. My stomach churned as the whispers grew louder, forming incoherent words that seemed to overlap and echo. Panicked, I grabbed the saw, determined to get rid of the cursed thing. But as I approached, the branches moved. They didn't sway, they reached. One wrapped around my wrist, its needles digging into my skin like tiny claws. I screamed, yanking myself free and stumbling backward. Desperate for answers, I searched online for any history of the farm. What I found chilled me to the core. Years ago, Willow Creek had been the site of a gruesome murder. A family who owned the land had been slaughtered and buried in the northern grove. Their bodies never recovered. Locals believed the trees had grown over the graves, their roots feeding on the dead. The whispers, The blood, the unnatural movement. It all made sense. The tree wasn't just a tree. It was a vessel, a prison for something that should have stayed buried. I couldn't leave it in my apartment. The whispers were growing louder, the air thick with malice. I dragged the tree outside, ignoring the searing cold against my bare feet. In the alley behind my building, I doused it in lighter fluid and struck a match. As the flames consumed it, the whispers turned into screams, agonized, inhuman wails that echoed through the night. The fire burned brighter than it should have, illuminating the entire alleyway. When it finally died down, all that was left was ash. I thought it was over, but every December the smell of blood lingers in my apartment, and sometimes late at night I still hear the faintest whisper, "Why did you burn me?" I wasn't supposed to be at the Evergreen farm that night. It wasn't even my kind of thing. Holiday cheer, freshly cut trees, festive jingles, none of it appealed to me. But when my best friend Sophie begged me to join her on a late-night errand to pick out the perfect Christmas tree, I reluctantly agreed. She didn't want to go alone, and I couldn't say no, especially with how desperate she sounded over the phone. The farm was a good 30 minutes from town, located at the end of a long, winding road surrounded by dense woods. By the time we arrived, the moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie silver glow over the snow-covered fields. The place should have been closed, but Sophie insisted she had called ahead and spoken to the owner, who agreed to let us browse after hours. Something about that arrangement felt off. The gate was unlocked, creaking ominously as we pushed it open. A hand-painted sign reading, "Evergreen Farm, open for the holidays," swayed in the cold wind. It looked cheerful, but the scene beyond it didn't match. The rows of trees stood silent and dark, their shadows stretching unnaturally long under the faint moonlight. "I told you this place was creepy," I muttered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. Sophie rolled her eyes. "You're such a baby. It's just trees. Come on, let's find one and get out of here." As we ventured deeper into the farm, the festive charm faded completely. There were no lights strung up, no decorations, no cheerful holiday music. The only sounds were our boots crunching through the snow and the occasional gust of wind that rattled the bare branches of the surrounding forest. "I thought you said this guy was expecting us," I said, glancing nervously at the rows of trees. "Where is he?" Sophie shrugged, looking down at her phone. "Maybe he's running late. Let's just look around. If we find something we like, we can drag it back to the car and leave the cash in the drop box." I didn't respond. My attention was fixed on a peculiar patch of trees up ahead. They looked different from the rest, taller, darker, their branches twisted and gnarled. The snow beneath them was untouched, as if no one had walked there in years. A shiver ran down my spine, though I wasn't sure if it was the cold or something else. "Let's go over there," Sophie said, pointing toward the ominous grove. "Are you kidding me?" I shot back. "That's literally the last place we should go. Don't be dramatic. They're just trees." Sophie grabbed my arm and started dragging me forward, her excitement undeterred by the unsettling atmosphere. As we entered the grove, the air seemed to change. It was colder here, heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest. I tried to brush it off, but every step deeper into the grove made my skin crawl. The trees were spaced oddly, their branches intertwining overhead like skeletal fingers. Sophie stopped suddenly, tilting her head. "Do you hear that?" I froze, straining my ears. At first there was nothing but the sound of the wind. Then I heard it. A faint rhythmic creaking, like wood bending under pressure. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, growing louder the deeper we went. "It's just the wind," Sophie said, though she didn't sound convinced. We continued walking, but the unease only grew. The air was filled with the pungent smell of damp earth and something metallic, almost like rust. Then I noticed the ground. It was different here. Not the clean white snow of the outer rows, but a muddy, uneven surface littered with what looked like bones. I stopped in my tracks. "Sophie, look at the ground." She glanced down and frowned. "What the hell? Are those—" Before she could finish her sentence, a low groan echoed through the grove. It was deep and guttural, like the sound of something immense shifting beneath the earth. The trees around us creaked violently, their branches shaking even though the wind had stopped. "We need to leave," I said, panic rising in my voice. But Sophie wasn't listening. She was staring at something ahead of us, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and fear. There, at the center of the grove, was a massive tree unlike any I had ever seen. Its trunk was black and warped, its bark covered in strange, spiraling symbols. At its base was a mound of disturbed earth, as if something had recently been buried there. "What is that?" Sophie whispered, stepping closer. I grabbed her arm. "We shouldn't be here, let's go." "Wait," she said, pulling free from my grasp. "What if this is what the guy was talking about? Maybe he wanted us to see this." "That doesn't make any sense," I snapped, but Sophie was already moving toward the tree. She knelt by the mound, brushing away some of the loose dirt. That's when we saw it. A fragment of what looked like a human jawbone, its yellowed teeth grinning up at us from the soil. Sophie screamed, stumbling backward, and that's when the whispers began. At first, they were barely audible, a faint murmuring that seemed to come from the trees themselves. But as the seconds passed, the voices grew louder, overlapping and echoing until they surrounded us entirely. "Leave!" one voice hissed. "Stay!" another growled, more menacing. Sophie was frozen in place, her face pale as a ghost. I grabbed her hand and pulled her to her feet. "We're leaving. Now." But the grove had other plans. As we turned to leave, the trees seemed to shift, their trunks moving closer together, their branches forming an impenetrable barrier. The whispers turned into laughter, cruel, mocking laughter that sent chills down my spine. Suddenly, the ground beneath us trembled. The mound at the base of the tree collapsed inward, revealing a dark, gaping hole. From within came a foul stench and the unmistakable sound of something moving. Sophie and I clung to each other, too terrified to run. A pale hand emerged from the hole, its fingers impossibly long and skeletal. Then another hand, clawing at the edge of the pit. "Run!" I screamed, shoving Sophie toward the narrow path we had come from. We sprinted through the grove, the laughter and whispers following us like a swarm of locusts. The trees clawed at us, their branches tearing at our clothes and skin. I could hear something behind us, something heavy and fast, its guttural growls shaking the air. We burst out of the grove and into the open rows of trees, gasping for breath. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. When I turned to look back, the grove was gone. Nothing but an empty field where it had once stood. We didn't speak as we ran to the car. Our only thoughts focused on getting as far away from that place as possible. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the tree, the mound, the hand clawing its way out of the earth. Sophie refused to talk about what had happened, insisting it was just a bad dream. But I knew better. A week later, I saw the news. The Evergreen farm had burned to the ground in what authorities called a mysterious accident. No one could explain the origins of the fire, but they did discover something chilling in the ashes. A mass grave, filled with dozens of human remains, all of them centuries old. I don't know what we disturbed that night, but I can still hear the voices sometimes, faint and distant. They whisper from the shadows, reminding me of the grove and the secrets buried beneath it. And every Christmas since, I can't shake the feeling that the trees are watching me. I didn't grow up celebrating Christmas like everyone else. For most of my childhood, the holiday season was just another time of year, filled with routine chores and little fanfare. But when I moved to the small town of Red Cedar, I thought it was time to embrace the tradition. Everyone here seemed obsessed with the holidays, and the entire town glowed with fairy lights and candy cane decorations. It felt like something out of a Christmas card. That year, I decided to cut my own Christmas tree for the first time. My coworker, Claire, suggested a place on the outskirts of town, the Morton Tree Farm. She raved about it, calling it the most authentic Christmas experience I'd ever have. I wasn't entirely sold on the idea of traipsing through snow to find a tree, but she insisted. "It's beautiful," Claire said, "and they let you choose the tree yourself. Trust me, you won't regret it." I should have known better. The farm was farther out than I'd expected. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping behind the hills, casting long shadows over the snow-covered fields. A crooked sign at the entrance read, Morton's Christmas Tree Farm, open dawn to dusk. The driveway leading into the farm was lined with towering pines, their dark silhouettes almost menacing in the fading light. I parked my car near a rickety wooden shack, where an old man sat bundled in a thick coat. His face was weathered, and his milky eyes didn't quite meet mine when I approached. "Looking for a tree?" he rasped. "Yes," I replied, suddenly unsure if this was a good idea. He handed me a dull handsaw and pointed toward the rows of trees behind the shack. "Stay out of the West Grove," he added. "Trees there aren't good." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he waved me off with a dismissive gesture, mumbling something under his breath. Against my better judgment, I decided not to press him. I walked into the rows of evergreens, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. The first few rows were filled with perfectly shaped trees, their branches heavy with snow. They were beautiful, but none of them felt right. I wanted something special, something that would stand out in my tiny apartment. The further I walked, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their branches knotted together like claws reaching toward the sky. The air here was still, too still. Even the crunch of my boots on the snow seemed muted. That's when I saw it. A tall, striking pine tree stood alone in a small clearing. Its dark green needles seemed to shimmer in the twilight, and its perfectly symmetrical shape made it look almost unreal. I felt an odd pull toward it, as though it had been waiting for me. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The ground beneath the tree wasn't covered in snow like the rest of the farm. Instead, the earth was dark and damp, as if it had just rained. My breath hitched, but I shook off the unease. I was being ridiculous, just overthinking things. I knelt down and began sawing through the trunk. The bark felt unusually soft, and the smell of pine was overwhelming, almost sickly sweet. As the tree tipped over, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against branches. I froze, scanning the trees around me, but there was no one there. Shrugging it off, I dragged the tree back to the car. The old man was gone when I passed the shack, and the place felt utterly deserted. Back in my apartment, I set up the tree and strung it with lights and ornaments. It was stunning, even more so than I had imagined. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pride. This was my tree, my first real step into the holiday spirit. But as the night went on, strange things began to happen. The first thing I noticed was the smell. The sweet pine scent had grown stronger, filling the room with an almost suffocating intensity. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the tree settling in. Then there were the noises. At first it was faint, a soft creak, like wood bending under pressure. But as the hours passed, the sounds grew louder. Branches rustling, ornaments swaying, the lights flickering in and out. I told myself it was just my imagination. Trees don't make noises. They don't move on their own. But then, in the dead of night, I saw it. I woke to the sound of a soft thud, like something had fallen. Groggy, I stumbled into the living room, expecting to find one of the ornaments on the floor. Instead, I found nothing out of place. That's when I saw the shadow. It wasn't the shadow of the tree or the furniture. It was something else. A figure, tall and thin, standing motionless among the branches. My heart stopped as I stared at it, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. And then it moved. The shadow shifted, slithering through the branches like smoke. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. The room grew colder, my breath visible in the dim glow of the tree lights. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The only response was a low, guttural sound, like a growl. Panic set in as the shadow grew larger, stretching out of the tree and onto the walls. It wasn't human. That much was clear. Its form was too fluid, too unnatural. I grabbed my phone, dialing for help, but the screen froze, the signal dead. The growling grew louder, reverberating through the apartment like thunder. The lights on the tree flickered wildly, casting the shadow in grotesque shapes across the room. With no other option, I grabbed my coat and bolted out the door. I didn't stop running until I was standing in the middle of the street, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I stayed at a friend's place that night, too afraid to return home. The next morning, I convinced myself it had all been a nightmare. But when I walked into my apartment, the smell hit me immediately, stronger than before. The tree was still there, standing perfectly in its corner, but something was different. The ornaments were gone, and the lights hung limp, their wires frayed. The damp earth beneath the tree had spread, staining the carpet with dark patches. I knew I couldn't leave it there. Grabbing an old axe from the storage closet, I approached the tree, my hands trembling. As I raised the axe, the shadow reappeared, coiling around the branches like a living thing. "You shouldn't have taken me," a voice rasped, low and guttural. I screamed, bringing the axe down with all my strength. The tree let out a sound, a horrible, otherworldly wail that shook the walls. I hacked at it again and again until it was nothing but splinters and shattered branches. I burned the remains of the tree in the alley behind my building, watching as the flames consumed its twisted form. The smoke was thick and black, carrying the scent of decay and pine. Since that night, I haven't celebrated Christmas. I moved out of the apartment a few months later, unable to shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Sometimes in the dead of night, I hear it, the faint rustling of branches, the low growl of something lurking just out of sight. And every December, the smell of sweet pine haunts me, a reminder of the shadow among the trees. The night I set foot on Grayson's Christmas tree farm, the air seemed unnaturally still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. It wasn't just the chill that made me uneasy. It was something heavier, something unseen but undeniably present. I was there out of obligation, fulfilling a promise to my sister, Claire, who had insisted we keep the family tradition alive despite the absence of our parents that year. "It'll be fun," Claire had said, her voice tinged with a forced cheerfulness. "Just you, me, and the perfect tree." The farm was tucked deep into the countryside, far from the nearest town. As our car bumped along the narrow dirt road leading to the entrance, I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. The trees lining the path were tall and blackened by shadow, their skeletal branches forming a jagged canopy overhead. When we finally arrived, the small wooden sign welcoming us to Grayson's farm swung lazily in the wind. Its paint was peeling, and the cheerful slogan beneath it, "Where Christmas comes alive," felt more like a warning than an invitation. Claire bounded out of the car, excitement plastered across her face. "Come on, Emma, let's find the best one before someone else does." "Who else would be here?" I muttered, scanning the empty parking lot. There wasn't a single other car in sight. An old man sat on a stool near the entrance, wrapped in layers of wool that did little to hide the frailty of his frame. His eyes were milky and distant, yet somehow sharp enough to pierce right through me when they settled on us. "Here for a tree?" he asked in a voice like dry leaves crumbling underfoot. Claire nodded eagerly. "We'll take a look around." The man waved us off but didn't offer any directions. As we stepped past him, he muttered something under his breath. I caught only fragments. "Watch. Cold. Don't linger." But Claire either didn't hear or chose to ignore him. The rows of evergreens stretched endlessly into the misty horizon. At first glance, they seemed like any other Christmas trees. Tall, symmetrical, their branches dusted with snow. But as we wandered deeper into the farm, something felt wrong. The air grew colder, sharper, and the trees began to change. Their needles were darker here, almost black, and their branches twisted in unnatural ways. Some trees leaned inward, as if conspiring against the intruders who dared to step among them. The farther we went, the harder it was to shake the feeling that we were being watched. Claire didn't seem to notice. She was too busy inspecting each tree, critiquing their shapes and sizes with the precision of a seasoned decorator. But I couldn't focus. My eyes kept darting to the shadows between the trees, where shapes seemed to shift and flicker just beyond my vision. "Emma, look at this one," Claire called out, her voice pulling me from my thoughts. I turned to see her standing next to a massive tree, its branches sprawling wide and low, as if beckoning us closer. Its trunk was thick and gnarled, and its needles glistened like shards of obsidian in the dim light. "It's perfect," Claire said, grinning. I wasn't so sure. There was something unsettling about the tree, something that made my stomach twist. But Claire was already pulling the handsaw from her bag, so I kept my mouth shut. The moment the saw bit into the bark, a low groan echoed through the grove. Claire froze, her hand trembling as she gripped the saw. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "It's just the wind," I lied, though I wasn't convinced myself. She resumed cutting, but as the blade sank deeper, a thick, dark liquid began to seep from the wound in the tree. At first I thought it was sap, but the color was wrong, too red, too much like blood. The smell hit us next, a sickly sweet stench that made my head spin. "Claire, stop!" I shouted, but it was too late. With a final push, the tree toppled to the ground, its branches rustling like a dying gasp. The moment it hit the earth, the air around us shifted. The cold intensified, biting through my coat and scarf as if I were standing naked in a blizzard. The whispers started then. Soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with every passing second. At first, the voices were incoherent, overlapping murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But as I strained to listen, certain words began to surface. "Leave. Why did you take it? Cold. So cold." Claire's face was pale, her breath coming in quick, shallow puffs. "Let's go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We hurriedly dragged the tree back toward the car, the whispers following us the entire way. They grew louder, more insistent, until they were no longer whispers but wails, agonized, bone-chilling screams that seemed to echo inside my skull. By the time we reached the parking lot, the old man was gone. His stool lay tipped over in the snow, and the gate that had been open when we arrived was now chained shut. "Emma," Claire said, her voice trembling, "how do we get out?" Panic set in as we realized the gate was the only way back to the road. The surrounding woods were too dense to navigate, and the icy wind made the thought of wandering aimlessly even more terrifying. "Let's leave the tree," I suggested, though I wasn't sure it would help. Claire hesitated, but the growing desperation in my voice seemed to convince her. We dropped the tree by the gate, its branches now dull and lifeless. For a moment, the whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. But then the ground began to tremble. From the snow-covered earth beneath the tree, shapes began to emerge. Pale, translucent figures clawed their way upward, their eyes hollow and their mouths frozen in eternal screams. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they were marionettes controlled by an unseen hand. Claire screamed, stumbling backward as one of the figures lunged toward her. Its bony fingers grasped at the air, leaving trails of frost in its wake. Stood at the edge of the lot, their hollow eyes watching us with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. We never spoke of that night again. Claire refused to set foot in a tree farm, and I avoided anything that reminded me of Christmas altogether. But sometimes in the dead of winter, I hear the whispers again. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the shack. The frostbitten souls gave chase, their wails filling the night. The cold was unbearable now, each breath like shards of glass cutting into my lungs. My legs felt heavy, my movements sluggish, as if the cold itself were trying to drag me down. We reached the shack and slammed the door behind us. The figures clawed at the walls, their nails splintering the wood as they tried to break through. "Why is this happening?" Claire sobbed, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice shaking, "but we can't stay here." I spotted a rusted axe leaning against the far wall and grabbed it, my hands trembling. If we were going to get out of this alive, I'd have to fight our way through. With a deep breath, I threw open the door and swung the axe at the nearest figure. It let out a shriek as the blade connected, its body dissolving into a burst of icy mist. Claire followed close behind, and together we ran toward the car. The figures pursued us, their wails growing fainter as we neared the parking lot. By the time we reached the car, they had stopped entirely. I glanced back one last time as we sped away. The frostbitten souls. And I wonder if the frostbitten souls are still waiting, trapped in that cursed farm, longing for warmth they'll never feel again. It was a bitter December evening when Leah first arrived at Evergreen Pines, a sprawling Christmas tree farm nestled deep in the rural countryside. She had taken the job to make a little extra money before the holidays, unaware of the farm's sinister reputation. To her, it seemed like the perfect seasonal gig. Hot cocoa breaks, festive lights, and the scent of fresh pine in the crisp winter air. The farm was owned by Mr. Barrett, a gruff but seemingly kind man in his late 60s. With his snow-white beard and plaid jacket, he fit the image of a quintessential Christmas character. Yet there was something unnerving about him. His eyes always darted to the trees when the wind blew through them, as if listening for something Leah couldn't hear. On her first day, Mr. Barrett gave her a quick tour of the farm. Rows upon rows of perfectly shaped pine trees stretched endlessly, their dark green needles swaying gently in the cold breeze. The air was heavy with the earthy scent of sap and damp soil. Barrett's tone turned grave as they reached the far end of the farm. "Stay away from the northern grove," he warned, pointing to an area where the trees were darker, their branches twisting unnaturally. "Bad things happen there." Leah laughed nervously, thinking it was some sort of initiation prank. "What kind of bad things?" Barrett's lips tightened. "Just don't go there." Leah shrugged off the warning and got to work, helping families pick out their Christmas trees and tying them to their car roofs. By the end of the day, she was exhausted but content, ready to head home. As she passed the northern grove on her way to the parking lot, a faint sound stopped her in her tracks. "Leah." The voice was soft, almost drowned out by the rustling of the pines. She froze, her heart pounding. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. She scanned the area but saw no one. "Must have been the wind," she muttered, shaking her head and quickening her pace. Over the next few days, Leah began to notice strange occurrences. Customers complained about cold spots among the trees, even when the sun was shining. A child got lost in the grove for nearly an hour, only to be found standing stock still, staring up at a tree with wide, tear-filled eyes. "They said it was whispering to me," the child told their mother, who hurriedly dragged them away. Leah couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were watching her. She often felt an eerie stillness settle over the farm, as if the pines were holding their breath. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on her tasks. But the whispers grew louder. "Lee, come closer." One night, as she was locking up the farm's small gift shop, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. A figure darted into the northern grove, its pale form almost glowing in the moonlight. Against her better judgment, Leah grabbed a flashlight and followed. The air grew colder as Leah entered the grove, her breath forming clouds that hung unnaturally still in the air. The trees here were nothing like the cheerful ones she had been working around. Their trunks were gnarled and blackened, their branches clawing at the sky like cursed talons. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The flashlight beam flickered and dimmed, casting long shadows that danced menacingly across the forest floor. Suddenly the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Leah, stay with us." Her stomach churned as she spun around, desperate to find the source. The beam of her flashlight caught something carved into the bark of one of the trees. Names. Dozens of names etched deep into the wood, each one crossed out except for a single, freshly carved name at the bottom. Her name. Leah staggered backward, the flashlight slipping from her grasp. The whispers turned into a cacophony, overlapping voices calling her name, pleading, taunting. "Don't leave us, Leah. Stay forever." She ran, her boots slipping on the icy ground, branches clawing at her jacket. The grove seemed endless, the trees shifting around her like a maze. Just as she thought she would never escape, she burst out into the open, collapsing in the snow under the glow of the farm's string lights. The next morning, Leah confronted Mr. Barrett. She slammed a cup of coffee onto the counter of the small cabin he used as an office, her hands trembling with anger. "What's going on here? What's wrong with that grove?" Barrett sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. "I was hoping you wouldn't find out." "Find out what? That this place is cursed, that those trees are alive?"